I drive a 1998 Ford Escort wagon. It doesn't have a lot of flashy options like air conditioning or a working passenger side seatbelt. The car belonged to my Grandpa Joe, who was a part of America's greatest generation that apparently had something against power windows. When I was 11, my father died, and my grandfather, who was a widower, moved from Chicago to North Carolina to help out. And I just moved to the South, too. And I was an outsider in my school because I was the only Asian kid, and I had a Massachusetts accent, and I could read at grade level. So I spent all my weekends at my grandfather's house, and he'd give me projects like building birdhouses out of used bleach bottles, or rendering lard from fatback, or organizing his vast collection of aluminum ashtrays he stole from Burger King. It was like summer camp, if you went to a camp themed around the Great Depression. And because he lived through the Depression, my grandfather never wanted to throw anything away. He kept all this junk in labeled boxes in his closets and bedrooms and shed. I thought he was crazy. And as he got older, he gave me the 1998 Ford Escort. He wasn't doing that great. Lots of chronic health problems like diabetes, which is an occupational hazard when you spend 40 years of your life as a baker and you weigh over 300 pounds. And I was driving that car from Northern Virginia to North Carolina when my mom called to tell me he was going to the hospital. I was supposed to be there hours earlier, but because I slept in, instead I arrived 45 minutes after he was pronounced dead. It was the day before Thanksgiving. I was crushed that I didn't get to say goodbye, and I wanted to give my mom all this input on the funeral, but she kept telling me and the funeral home in Chicago that she didn't want to have a big production. So the next day, because everything was closed, we had Thanksgiving. And if I had to critique that meal, I'd say it was lacking a certain festive feel. It's sort of like a holiday special directed by Terrence Malick with special guest existential angst. The next day, my mom, brother, and I flew to Chicago, and we hadn't really thought about how to get to the cemetery, so we had to hail a cab. And when the cabbie got to the cemetery, he said, "That'll be $30. And Mom, without missing a beat, said, "Stay here, we'll be right back." So we met the funeral director, a real young guy, and he looked nervous, and I think it was because he wasn't sure if we understood what was actually going to happen. So he says, "Well, we're going to bring your grandfather in here, and we'll open the casket, and then we'll take him away for interment." So he leaves, and these two guys in white jumpsuits wheel my grandfather in on a steel gurney. And as soon as I saw the coffin, it was apparent that whatever attempt was made to upsell my mother in a nicer casket was unsuccessful. We had gone off the shelf, and the coffin was not custom built, and as I mentioned earlier, my grandfather was a gentleman of large carriage, so when they opened the lid, he looked like he was bursting out of the coffin, not unlike a rising loaf of bread. A fitting end for a baker. So we stand there for a couple of minutes, and my mom's crying, and then I notice the funeral director's re-entered the room. And he's looking at us like we're the saddest thing he's ever seen, which is saying a lot for a man in his line of work. It's obvious that he feels bad, and so he says sheepishly, "Would you like to see us intern the body?" And my mom says yes. So he says he's going to pull around in a hearse, and he asks me what kind of car we're driving, and I tell him we have a cab waiting outside. And his face makes this expression that says, "That makes this sadder." So we get back in the cab, and the cab driver has no idea what's going on. He has no clue. We've only been gone for 10 minutes. But he gets real quiet when he sees my mom. So the hearse pulls around, and we follow it to the back of the funeral home, and then this gigantic garage door opens up, and this huge flatbed truck emerges, carrying a 5-foot-tall cement block and a big yellow crane on the back. Now, I didn't know this, but when people die, they put the coffin in a concrete vault. Most people spend lots of money, so you don't have to see any of that. But my grandfather, who was shoved into an itty-bitty coffin, is now ensconced in 3 tons of cement on the back of a flatbed truck, followed by a hearse and a yellow cab. And the cab driver, for the first time realizing that he's a part of the world's shittiest funeral procession, has the wits about him to turn on his headlights. We get to the plot, and the two guys in white jumpsuits, now wearing yellow hard hats, get out and start working the noisy crane. And they get my grandfather halfway suspended into his grave like a prize in an industrial toy claw machine when the funeral director motions for them to stop. He turns around and he says, "Would anyone like to say anything?" And as my grandfather's hanging there like some kind of obscene death piñata, we're at a loss for words. So the funeral director looks at the two guys and he goes, and they pull a lever, the concrete block hits the ground with a thud, and the funeral director turns around and goes, "So, that's it." So we get back in the cab, and my mom's in the back seat crying, and my brother's consoling her. And it's at this moment that I realize that our cab driver is having a very awkward moment. And I see that he keeps looking in the rear view like he wants to say something to make my mom feel better. And we get back on the parkway, and no one has said a thing. And finally the cabbie says, "That was the most beautiful funeral I have ever seen." But you know what? That's exactly the kind of funeral my grandfather would have wanted. Just stick him in the ground next to Grandma and he would have been happy. You know, when someone dies, over time, it's like you lose them all over again. They get flattened from a three-dimensional person into a collection of memories you get in these flashes, and then they just slip away. 6 years later, I can't remember the sound of my grandfather's voice. When we got back home, my mom hired a couple of guys, and they went through the house and shed, and they threw everything away. And today, the only real, tangible thing I have left of my grandfather is a 1998 Ford Escort wagon. And when people ask me, why don't I just get a new car, I say, I don't know. I guess I'm just trying to get another 1,000 miles. Thank you.